So this gave rise to the African Renaissance. So you find that as was in contemporary China, where there was the Confucian revival. In Africa, we then had the famous African Renaissance. Remember, this was not like the very first time where Africa had sought to reconnect with its Africanness, with its original African religion. Pan-Africanism had also been founded on this concept of African Renaissance. So you find that African Renaissance was geared at going back to an African philosophy that was rooted in the whole Ubuntu philosophy, I am because we are. So as the national leaders realized that corruption was rampant, and with the call for democratization, there was then this response where they are saying, let's yet again go back to adopting the Ubuntu philosophy, where the emphasis is on the community rather than individuals. So you find that the African Renaissance was regarded as a political, economic, and cultural vision that envisaged and aimed to achieve the development of the continent's material, human resources, as well as the upliftment of the continent's inhabitants. So the vision emphasized that the inhabitants of Africa had to take responsibility for their own renaissance. So it was Africans needed to take responsibility for their own progress. Africans needed to take responsibility for their own development. So what it sought to do, remember, like what I've said, that over the 100 years of colonization, Africans had been disconnected. The economic and political aspect of Africans had been disconnected from their spirituality. So the African Renaissance was in a way trying to reconnect the economic and the political aspects of Africa yet again to its spirituality. So you find that the economic and the political dimensions of the African Renaissance encompass sustainable development, the promotion of democracy and good governance, the need for peace, as well as the termination of neo-colonialism and the negative consequences of the latter. So this was an attempt to reconnect the economic and the political aspects of the African reality to their spirituality. But was it enough? Is the African Renaissance enough to propagate Africa into its next level of development? And as I've always already said, as I began this conversation, as we looked at how Africa continues to be a paradox, how Africa has continued to be marred by poverty, yet it is one of the wealthiest continents, how Africa has continued to be plagued by hunger, yet it is the greatest proportion of the world's arable lands. You then begin to question even the effectiveness of the African Renaissance. And friends, let me at this point submit this to us. What I believe has been one of the key limitations of the African Renaissance, and what I believe has hindered the African Renaissance from achieving its full potential, and what I also believe has hindered the African indigenous churches slash the Pentecostal movement from also achieving its fullest potential in as far as bringing transformation within Africa, within the African context, is that deficiency which I mentioned earlier. That deficiency which came as a result of the disintegration of the moral and the ethical code that Africans lived by pre-colonial. So as the African church has grown over the last 20 to 30 years, post-colonialism, post-independence, if you like us to call that, as the African church has grown, the African church has emphasized the economic empowerment of the African person. It has emphasized the social empowerment of the African person, but it has not been as deliberate about emphasizing and establishing and developing a moral and ethical code, which is to go and to restrict or to govern that prosperity. And this is the same for the African Renaissance. So even as some leaders and some sections of Africa have sought to go back to the Ubuntu philosophy, have sought to go back to pre-colonial African religion. It is within a context where we are having a disintegrated moral and ethical code of conduct. So you find that even the African Renaissance began around 1996. But now, 2023, you find that it seems corruption is actually on an increase. Africa is still gravely hindered by corruption. And I believe that the missing link has been ethical and moral code, which disintegrated as a result of colonial Christianity, which disintegrated as a result of that disconnection of the African from their spirituality. That is the aspect of the economic, the political, and the social as well. So the African person, as they survived and lived through the 100 years of colonialism, did not then deliberately nurture and force a moral and ethical code for their societies. So even with the advent of independence, even with the emergence of the African indigenous churches, which then sought to correct the censored Christianity or the censored gospel that was being ministered or shared to the African people during colonization, even then you find that the indigenous African churches have not been as deliberate as they should be when it comes to addressing the moral and the ethical code for the African society. And with the African Renaissance as well falling short in that regard. And I believe, friends, this is why we still are where we are as an African people. This is what has stalled our progress. This is what has hindered us from fully optimizing on our capacities as an African people. This is why we continue to have bad leadership within the African context, in spite of how Africa is yet again reconnected with this spirituality, in spite of how Africa is yet again reconnected its daily life with its spiritual life. It has not done so in the context of a well-defined moral and ethical code. So friends, let me stop here for today. So next week, we'll be now picking up from there and discussing how then can we build from this current reality? How then can we foster a theology, a Christian theology, which is pro-development, which is pro-progress, which also is anti-corruption? How then can we begin to have our Christianity as the young people in today's context beginning to both impact in our daily lives, in our economies, and indeed in our politics? So that's what we'll be covering next week. But I believe from today's session, we have a good appreciation of how we are where we are and how it will be difficult, if not impossible, for us to think of going back to a pre-colonial African religion. Why? Because the worldview, that worldview has evolved over time. As that worldview interacted with the different worldviews over the centuries, we cannot hope to have yet again a purely African religious worldview. We need to develop a more development-oriented African worldview, which I'm now calling the contemporary African worldview, which is built around the Christian faith, as we have seen that Christianity has now become the predominant informant of today's worldview. So we will talk more about that next week.